Hey, just made a quick actively doing right now, making a quick recording of the presentation I gave the other day, so that you could uh, view at your leisure, enjoy at two times speed, if that's what you would prefer. So, without further ado, let's hop right into it. So, before I get started with anything else, brief preface on feedback. Is a method of guiding feedback. I often just give people an idea of what my goals are for any particular thing. In this case, the research I'm about to describe, as well as my progress towards achieving those goals. Regarding the goals, I'd quite like to use this to apply for NSF fellowship, turn it into my master's thesis, and take it on the road to other conferences, other workshops, other opportunities to get feedback. And then regarding progress, broadly, what I would describe this as is a robust hypothesis. I have two empirical findings that are hard to explain. It's hard to explain what that connection is. I have a theory as to what that connection would be. I have some historical examples, but I'd quite like to gather my own primary data, and build a more robust case for the principle I'll describe a little bit later. All of that is to say, cases are what I'm really interested in. So let's hop in. So what I'll be speaking on today is the relationship between population collapse and rates of child labor. Specifically, what I will argue is that population collapse directly contributes to an increase in rates of child labor. What this argument will look like is we'll start with an examination of those two empirical phenomena, population collapse and increased rates of child labor. I'll then posit the underlying mechanisms for how one accelerates the other. I abstract from this relationship a principle that can be tested against historical cases. I conclude then with a reevaluation of my hypothesis in the light of the evidence that I've described, and then with a brief small tangent on what I think next steps might look like. So we begin with population collapse. Population collapse, it's not so easily observed or understood when looking at the gross population of the United States mapped over time. As you can see here, there's an obvious linear growth present. What population collapse is in reference to is a change, right now at least, is a major change in the demographic makeup of the population. And that is because the fertility rate, how many children are had per woman, has been falling since the 1960s. And it fell below replacement levels, the level of fertility needed to maintain a population. It's fell below those levels since the early 1970s. As a result of this and other factors, we can see that the natural growth rate, which here references the rate of change of the population only accounting for births and deaths inside of the United States, has been steadily falling since the 1960s. And this is despite great gains in life expectancy during that time, which is to say, theoretically, fewer deaths. So returning to the gross population graph that you can see here, how can we account for the steady growth of the US populations? Well, if we segment the populations into age groups, then we isolate those age cohorts that are seeing the greatest amount of change, we can see that those between the ages of 25 and 64 and those ages 65 plus, those are the populations that are growing in relation to the other population cohorts. So we can see here those same population cohorts, but as a percentage of the total population. This is what that looks like in the 1980s. This is what that same demographic makeup looks like today. That's an 11-point shrinkage of what we would describe maybe broadly as young people as a percentage of the population. So population collapse at this moment isn't about the population necessarily shrinking, although that will occur in the near future if we continue to have as few children as we do now. But what it references now is the demographic makeup of the population, how it's shifting dramatically and resulting in fewer young people as a percentage of the population than in any other time in American history. The other half of this equation, the growth of American populations, is migration flows. It is immigration that stabilizes the population growth rate of the United States, even in the face of such a low fertility rate. But therefore, the recent increase in deportation and the corresponding decrease, the recent increase in deportation and the corresponding decrease in net migration will only exacerbate the population collapse that we're seeing today. So we have this empirical phenomena of population collapse. And it made me worry about my own research. I'm interested in child labor. How relevant will child labor be in a world where children become fewer and fewer as a percentage of the total population? Logically, the fewer children there are, the more valuable broadly you might expect them to become, right? There would be more resources that could be allocated to children where there are fewer of those children. But this contrasts, this assumption, this kind of natural conclusion contrasts with the rapid increase in utilization of child labor in the United States, which is the next thing we'll be looking at. So the number of minors employed in violation of child labor law quadrupled from the years of 2013 to 2022 in the United States. The work permits received by children from 2018 to 2022 doubled in Wisconsin. But as you can see in these graphs, from around 2022, 2023, we start to see a downward trend in these rates. So is the trend that I'm describing likely to continue, or are we going to see fluctuations? What explains this dip? I would suggest that this dip is not indicative of fewer children being moved and utilized in the workforce, but rather a representation of a changing legal landscape in relation to child labor law. And that is because since 2021, at least 61 bills to roll back child labor protections have been introduced in 29 states, and at least 17 of those bills has been enacted in 13 states. The intent of these bills is to strip back child labor protections, and they have bipartisan support in both traditionally blue and red states. The intent of these bills is to eliminate the need for work permits. And you can see Wisconsin here, right? So when we're looking at the dip in work permits allocated to children, maybe that has to do with whether or not work permits are any longer required. They're looking to extend allowable work hours, including graveyard shifts, decrease the age at which alcohol can be served, decrease the standard for what qualifies as hazardous work, allow for children to be paid a sub-minimum wage, and much more. My assertion that the United States is broadly rolling back child labor protections is seemingly complicated by the states that are claiming to pass more robust child labor standards. And you can see those states mapped out there. That is until you look more closely at legislation itself. So let's use Illinois as an example. So we want to understand whether or not the child labor law of 2024 that went into effect in January 2025, this was passed, it's gone into effect, it's now in effect, that was sponsored by 24 Democrats and one Republican. We want to understand somewhat empirically whether or not it increases or decreases child labor protections. And so having read this, coming up with that kind of empirical metric, it's important for me to describe some of what this does. So first off, this act only applies to minors aged 15 and younger. For those between the ages of 14 and 15. It is only the prohibitions within this act that apply, which is to say you're legally allowed to work between the ages of 14 and 15, unless prohibited, unless in an industry or in a situation prohibited by this law. For minors 13 and under, they, quote, may not be employed in any occupation or at any work site unless explicitly authorized by or exempted under the law. So this is to say, if we want to understand what this law has changed, measure the degree to which it increases or decreases the protections for child laborers, then we need to pay attention to what it prohibits and what it exempts. So let's dive into that. First, the prohibitions. I have here side by side the forms of labor prohibited to children before and after this law was enacted. It's very hard to read. That's all right, because they are identical. So much so that they kept the same spelling mistakes. For example, that's not how you spell sheet metal, and this is not how you spell program. But you can see a little bit at the bottom there is overlap. There was a change made. Having read it, I'll spoil the whole thing for you and tell you that it has to relate with the prohibition for children to be working around firearms. What was changed was an exception was made. 14-year-old can now work around firearms as long as it's at particular kinds of shooting events. So, taking a larger look, we can say that no prohibitions were added as a result of this law. And in fact, if we critically analyze what remains, these are required by federal law, these prohibitions. These prohibitions relate specifically to alcohol, marijuana, or live adult entertainment. And then this final one, probably the most interesting and important, specifically exempts children from the previous prohibitions as long as they're doing admin work that doesn't expose them to the work that are being done in those places having to do with marijuana, alcohol, or once again, live adult entertainment. So as long as you're in the back office, you can work in a strip club as a child. Oh, and finally, importantly, they misspelled administration. So I don't want to caricature this law. It did increase the fines associated with violations, as well as its classification. They introduced vlogging as a form of labor that, while limited in scope, is broadly a good thing. Child entertainment workers deserve protections as much as anyone else. But importantly, the way this law has been framed disguises what its real goal seems to be, which is to cement exceptions to the child labor laws, functionally loosening what labor children can engage in. For example, you can do agricultural work as young as 10 years old, as long as a relative lives on the farm, which, to be precise, the relative doesn't own the farm, they just live on it. So this creates a loophole where children as young as 10 can work on farms as long as family members are also working there. Care work in private residences is another one that stands out. One of the very few kinds of work that had absolutely no age restriction associated with it. And once again, we have to be precise about this. It's care work in any private residence, as long as you're cleaning or babysitting in anyone's home and it's not associated with any kind of business, which is vague language. I don't know if that has to do with an LLC or something along those lines. As long as you're doing that, doesn't have to be your private residence, doesn't have to be relatives or friends. As long as you're working in someone's private residence, you can do this as young as 8, 6, theoretically 2. There is no limit for care work in particular. And then finally, it paves the way for waivers for employers to apply for. that allow them to employ children overnight in many of these industries. Another example of an exception that was created as a result of this law. So, what can we say about the degree to which this law increases child labor protections? Well, we can say that at least for this one, it actively doesn't. And if that is true for this law, that it's been framed as increasing those protections, but isn't, then what can we say about all these other bills that have been passed utilizing the framing of bolstering child labor laws? We can say that at the very least, they don't necessarily do so. And in fact, a future avenue of research should be to really critically analyze the degree to which these laws do so. So, returning again to these graphs, isolating, trying to explain what this dip might be, I contend that this dip represents the changing legislative environment around child labor laws, and has much less to do with whether there are fewer children actually working. Specifically, it's referencing the deregulation of child labor and the increased legality of employing younger and younger children. So we have population collapse on one side and an increase in child labor usage on the other. At a time when children are a smaller percentage of the population than they've ever been before, they're being used for labor at increasing rates. Why? It's a question I've asked myself since reading about this. Shouldn't children be, once again, more valued now than ever? Doesn't using them as labor imply that they're being devalued? To understand this, we must first understand what the true threat of population collapse really is, because it's not intuitive. What you have to ask yourself is, why fear a declining population? I'll use a population boom as a foil to kind of make this clear. In the 80s, there was an unjustified amount of fear regarding a booming population around the globe. Unjustified because it wasn't actually happening. As you can see from the data, fertility rates were already dropping around that time. But the fear of a booming population, right, puts one in a scarcity mindset. It makes intuitive sense immediately. For every additional person added to a population, assuming static resources, the fewer amount of resources there are that can be allocated per person, right? That's why we measure things per capita. So, right, if that's true, wouldn't the opposite be true for a population collapse, where there are fewer people? Don't we have more resources per person in a world where climate change is a perpetual threat? Doesn't a shrinking population, where freely chosen, imply that there may be a road to fewer resources being used for fewer greenhouse gases and things like that? But that's not, right? That's not the threat of population collapse, because it is a real threat. To understand that threat, though, the threat isn't a problem for resource distribution. The threat it presents is to capital accumulation. So to describe that in a bit of detail, we just briefly describe how the economy functions in relation to GDP. GDP growth is necessary for a stable economy. GDP broadly is the sum of all transactions in an economy. The two sides of every transaction is buyer and seller. The seller, or supply side, is a function of labor supply by technology, by capital, and the buyer or buy side is a function of the consumer supply by investment, by government supply. So what do we see on both sides of this transaction? What's present in each one? Well, we have labor supply and consumer supply. And broadly, what those phrases are referencing is people. So what happens when your population collapses? What is the true threat of population collapse? It's economic collapse. Children, in the face of this, in the face of the true threat of population collapse, which is economic collapse because of collapse of the labor pool, I think we can now understand why children become more valuable, because they actually do become more valuable in this case, but they become more valuable as labor and not as anything else. So from this idea, I came up with a principle. I'm calling it the labor boundary principle, an abstraction from what I'm observing regarding child labor. And what that principle states is where there is more capital or state demand than there is labor supply, capital and the state will conspire to include new categories of people as laborers where those categories of people weren't considered labor previously, right? And if we were to look at this, if we were to formalize this, it's a basic supply-demand equation where if the supply for labor is smaller than the demand for labor, which is to say where this equation is greater than 1, we'll see the state expanding what constitutes a laborer, expand the boundary of what constitutes a laborer. Formalizing this phenomena is helpful for evidentiary purposes. Specifically, if I were to look to the past and I find examples where this principle may manifest itself, which is to say, I find examples where demand for labor is high and supply is low, I can ask, what do I see? Does it correspond with that principle I've just described? And so that's what I'm going to do. We'll start in 1941, during the Great Depression, not when it started, just during. Demand for labor is low, supply is high, and women are essentially barred from factory labor. In many states, it's illegal for married women to engage in factory labor, and everywhere it's discouraged. Broadly, the intensive nature of factory work was conceived of as being too difficult for women. In fact, the suggestion was that the factories couldn't possibly function where women were employed. Let's go forward 1 year, 1942. The United States enters into World War II. Demand for labor and supply for labor flips. Suddenly, the demand for labor is massive because of the commodities necessary to engage in warfare, and the supply collapses because most working age men are sent off to that war abroad. So what do we see in this case? Well, we see Rosie the Riveter. Women suddenly flood into factories. What was generally accepted to be impossible just a year before becomes a norm. Women were a disqualified category of labor in factories. Suddenly labor was needed, supply for labor collapsed, and the boundary of what's conceived as acceptable forms of labor expanded. Moving on to another example, the colonization of the New World and the forced displacement of African labor. Eric Williams, pictured here, wanted to understand what justified the expensive triangle slave trade from an economic standpoint. What made the forceful transference of enslaved people more economically viable, more profitable than just using local labor? His conclusion was that there was a lack of surplus labor in the New World, in the Americas. Western-born epidemics had decimated the native peoples, and of those who were left, they could not so easily be pressed into labor. Native peoples were not market dependent. They could live off the land, and their familiarity with the landscape made it difficult to keep them enslaved. So if plantation owners wanted labor, they needed to import it from abroad. So we see again that's the same principle proved out by history. The demand for labor is high in the New World, and the supply is low. And so, what the boundaries of what constitutes labor expand to include the forceful transference of African labor to the New World. So fundamental this principle seems to be that you can see it the very genesis of capitalism. Proletarianization of the peasantry in England, the removal of the peasantry from their access to the land, the transformation of peasants into laborers, theoretically follows this principle, right? Peasants were coerced into market dependence by the state that passed laws that removed them from their land and required from them their labor. The need for labor at the very genesis of capitalism was high, and the supply was low because peasants weren't market dependent and therefore were more easily able to avoid active participation in the market. So looking for more contemporary examples is a little more difficult because there are no categories of people exempt from labor anymore. That is, other than children, which is my broader point. But there are still important categories of labor that include exemptions. And the example I'd be looking at, that I'm going to show here, is mandatory military service. South Korea being a very good example. South Korea has the lowest fertility rate of any nation in the world. It is one of the lowest fertility rates. It also has mandatory military service. That mandatory military service includes exemptions for orphans, for North Korean defectors, and probably most importantly for women, almost half of the populations. And importantly, South Korea thinks of the maintenance of its military size as imperative because of its relationship with its northern neighbor. So we see here a demand that's very high for soldiers and a dwindling supply of young people. And because of this, South Korea has discussed options for eliminating the exemptions for, again, orphans, North Korean defectors, and women. We see demand high, supply low. The boundary of what is acceptable labor expands. Ukraine is another obvious example. Ukraine has passed the bill to decrease the age of conscription from 27 to 25. So the example of Ukrainian soldiers relates specifically to age. So I've tested the labor boundary principle, as I'm calling it, against historical and contemporary examples, and I find that it holds. It holds to such an extent that initially I was looking for cases that corresponded with the principle. Now I'm actively looking for cases that don't. But does the boundary labor principle necessarily explain the increased utilization of child labor? No, I don't think so, not yet. I need to do more to prove this relationship. But in the meantime, we can ask the legislators who are responsible for deregulating child labor what their motivations are. Here we have Ron DeSantis. What's wrong with expecting our young people to be working part-time? Why do we say we need to import foreigners, even import them illegally, when, teenagers used to work at these resorts? So it's quite obvious what he's saying there. He says, as a person who's responsible for eliminating a sizable portion of the immigrant surplus labor supply, he's actively suggesting that they utilize children to fill the gap that immigrant labor previously did. I'd like to isolate that phrase. Why do we need to say import foreigners? DeSantis is unknowingly, implicitly referencing that Eric Williams argument that I described earlier regarding the justification behind the slave trade. once again, importing labor, an important and necessary aspect of the American labor supply. Here we have Ryan Kramer. If I know that 14 to 17-year-old children can work 15 hours this week and they're happy, then I feel like the investment I'm making in their wage will help me take care of customers. Reynolds was being asked about his perspective on shifting the maximum hours children of 14 and older can work from 10 hours to 15 hours. What he's saying is, reading between the lines, although it's quite explicit, is that if the child labor laws were more relaxed, more deregulated, then he'd hire more children and it'd make him more able to satisfy his customers. And he is already very much so employing children. More than 20% of the workforce at his companies, roughly 140 stores, are aged 14 to 17. So finally, conclusion and next steps. Here I've visualized the kind of causal phenomena that I'm hypothesizing. And I want to pause here just to be very precise about the mechanisms that I'm describing here. I'm not suggesting that employers and legislators are targeting children because they're evil or because it's convenient. And I'm not suggesting they would target children if they had another choice. What I'm saying is that in the case where the labor pool is shrinking, firms can only include what is already excluded. So would these companies choose first to employ gendered labor? Absolutely. But they already have. It's already included. BIPOC labor? Absolutely. But it's already included. Immigrant labor? Either already included or is actively being expunged. So what I'm suggesting is that child labor is the only exempt population of laborers that firms and the state can expand the boundaries into. And therefore, we can expect this phenomena of child labor to only accelerate as the population continues to collapse, the immigrant population continues to be targeted, and the labor pool shrinks. So that's the idea. Regarding what's next, what I need more than anything, as I referenced at the start, in one word, is cases. I need primary data I can test my labor boundary principle against to add, what's the good word for this? To add context, to add texture to the intervening variables that are most likely almost absolutely there. That would more robustly enable me to argue for the labor boundary principle. Qualitatively or quantitatively, comparing states or nations where population changes are similar or different. Do we see similar rates of increasing or decreasing of child labor? Once again, this will allow me to kind of isolate what intervening variables there are: labor union penetration, child labor law as it had existed previously. These would figure into that kind of formalization of the principle that I described earlier. Another thing is just kind of bare bones measuring rates of child labor. How do I go about measuring this phenomena where the measurements that are being used relate to the activity being illegal, where that activity is increasingly being rendered legal? How am I able to record instances of it occurring? I have to work through that idea, understand how I go about that process. And then finally, a new addition to the sociology. That's fine. We'll move on to qualitative. Qualitatively, my original project of unregulated digitally mediated child labor is still on the table. That's what started me on this journey. Agriculture seems to be a nexus here. So for much of the child labor usage in the United States, getting access to sites agricultural sites that are employing children or not employing children, and understanding what the differentiations between those are would be really interesting. And then also, as I referenced earlier, the legal landscape, right? Absolutely needs some kind of critical examination to understand what's occurring there. So I've taken up a fair amount of your time, but thank you for sticking with me through that. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts if you have any. If you don't, that's also absolutely fine. All I have to say is thank you very much for taking the time to listen. So I hope you have a great day. Thank you.